Hello, everyone. My name is Era Suksi, and I'm the director of the School for Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities, or SASAH. I want to extend my warmest welcome to our second event in this year's SASAH Speaker Series. We're so honored and happy to be hosting Summer Bressette's presentation on land-based storytelling. I'll have more to say about Summer in a minute or two, but first, we'll begin by acknowledging the land, and then Michael Milda, Dean of Arts and Humanities, will make some opening remarks. I'm speaking to you from the home of SASAH, Western University, which is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape and Chinanton nations. And these are lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We affirm our respect for the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are its original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, our research, and our community service. Thank you. I'll now call on Dean Michael Milda to make some remarks.
Thanks very much, Ara, and thanks for the land acknowledgement, particularly important, I think, today as we're going to be talking about land and storytelling. Great pleasure to welcome our audience to the SASAH Speaker Series, where we really connect with important issues for arts and humanities, and I think through the arts and humanities to all of us as human beings. Real pleasure today to welcome Summer Bressette. As Ara said, she's going to get a full introduction in a minute, but I just want to say what a great honor it is for me as Dean to welcome Summer to this series and to this presentation. I've had the pleasure of working with her on a couple of events. Most recently, I saw her production of Love Song for the Thunderbirds at the Grand Theatre. First live theater I had seen since March of 2020. And it was just a sheer delight. And the gift for storytelling was obviously there. Many of you will know that Summer is a really strong friend of the School for Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities, having worked with SASAH students on a video production called For Home and Native Land, which really tells the story of Arnold Logan from the Munsee Delaware nation and a soldier in the First World War. Who fought and died in France. A very moving story, and that connection of his story with this area and with us as people who live on this land and who are at Western and connect with Munsee Delaware in that way, very powerful. Storytelling is an art, we're told, but it is also more than that. So much of human knowledge is transmitted through our stories, through our capacity for narrative, for our understanding of stories. And it's really storytelling that allows us to bridge differences among peoples and to establish connections. So I'm really excited to welcome Summer here, and I'm going to turn things back to Ara for a full introduction. So Ara, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'll now say a few things about Summer. There's a lot to say about her, and I'll try not to go on for too long. Summer Bressette is Anishinaabe from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. She's strongly rooted in her family and community stories and has worked as an artist and storyteller for nearly 10 years. She completed her master's degree in Indigenous Education here at Western University in 2013. Summer is an educator, a curator, a consultant, and as Michael said, most recently, a playwright. Her beautiful first play, Love Song for the Thunderbirds, just debuted in October at the Grand Theatre. She also co-curated an exhibit for Museum London, and I'm sorry if I'm mutilating that pronunciation. It means they did not let it go. And it was also presented at the Lambton Heritage Museum with the title Nnigiiwemin, we are going home, to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Ipperwash Crisis. Summer currently works at the London Arts Council as the curator of Indigenous programming. For Summer, storytelling is a way to connect with community and build kinship, to decolonize education, and to center Indigenous ways of doing and seeing. I too have been an admirer, like Michael, of Summer's wisdom, strength, and storytelling since I first encountered her in the film documentary Home and Native Land. And she also is appearing in a new film documentary, Nsatung, that showcases Indigenous youth and their perspectives on education. Nsatung is directed by an Arts and Humanities alumnus, Gisis Najuan, and produced by Lawrence Deleuze. It's currently in production, funded by grants from Western's Office of Indigenous Initiatives, the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and SASAH. After Summer's presentation, we should have a few minutes for questions. We have two SASAH fourth year students on our panel, and they have questions ready for Summer. Members of the audience can submit their questions via the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar. I am so happy to have Summer Bressette with us today. Please join me in welcoming her, and I'll hand it over to you, Summer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nnigiiwemin. Bujo Neo Benasik Indigenous Mong and Dodem. Will Kadang Minoa Ajodanang in Donjaba Anishinaabe Kwe Minoa Budwatami Queen Dao Misho Masiba Nonja Dashkan Ziving. And I'm really happy to be invited to speak tonight for SASA's speaker series. And I guess for me, part of the excitement too is, having been in arts and humanities in my undergrad years at Western, it seems like many, many years ago now, and things have changed so much since then. And I've been involved in a lot of projects over these past 2 years. So the pandemic hasn't been I would say a very quiet time for me. I've been quite busy throughout the pandemic. One of my first projects, even before the first shutdown back in March 2020, I was working with the Grand Theatre on their production of Honor Beat. And I really enjoyed that experience. And following that, a few months later, I was approached by Museum London to help curate an exhibit around the 25th anniversary of Ipperwash. And that was a very special project for me because my home community is Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. And so I wanted to be able to tell the story of my community and the tragic events that led up to the shooting death of Dudley George in 1995, and the events following. And I feel like there's a lot of sensationalizing around those events without realizing how triggering and traumatizing talking about that is for our community and for our community members, including myself, who are still healing from that, not just Ipperwash 1995, but, the whole land appropriation, 1942, and even before that. So I think for me, that was a really special project. And it was a labor of love to be able to do that, in honor of my community. And as Ara said earlier, I'm very, very strongly rooted in my community stories. And it's really interesting for me to be able to do this work currently, because for a lot of many years, I would say the first 20 years after I went through my undergrad program, I, as an artist, storyteller, I didn't feel that there was any place for my stories. It's always fallen under the weight, of a very oppressive and privileged canon of literature, of art, of art history. And while I was in my undergrad years at Western, at that time, that was 1997, I didn't feel myself or see myself represented in any of the literature that I was studying, in any of the art. And, I love art, I love storytelling, but it was, oftentimes really disheartening and lonely for me to go through my undergrad years then. And, I worked for 20 years in my community. And I think on my 40th birthday, I decided that the next 20 years of my life, I was going to spend living creatively and exploring my creativity. And there was a real paradigm shift that happened um, for me when I was in my master's program. And so I guess before I get into like all of the presentation, I do want to share a story about how this paradigm shift happened for me. Because for 20 years, in the 20 years or so, since graduating the first time around, I worked in my community, I worked in education, I worked in a lot of administration type positions. And I thought, this is leadership. This is leadership because, I'm working in policy and I'm working in administration. So I went to school to do my master's 2011 to 2013 in the Faculty of Ed. And so my supervising professor at the time was Rebecca Coulter. And so she provided, tremendous support and guidance, she and Brent DeBossigi. And I remember, um, for our cohort, we wrote a book. We published a book together, and everyone contributed a chapter. And so my chapter was on my grandmother and her stories, and how she experienced all of these sort of like very colonial and oppressive policies throughout her lifetime, and how that impacted her, and the choices that she made, and how she became a leader in our community. And so I was working on my chapter, and I was typing on my laptop, and you have to understand, um, this was the first time in my life that I had a laptop. I I completed most of my masters with, using a friend's laptop or borrowing laptops. I didn't have access, this is 2011, to internet, to my own things. And I think this speaks to the digital inequities that exist that we don't often consider for Indigenous students and Indigenous communities, because um, in the city here in London, there's Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi everywhere, and in First Nations communities, that's not often the case. You have families and households oftentimes sharing maybe one phone with Wi-Fi or with internet, or you have households with one computer or one laptop or tablet. And so it seems funny for me to say, because now I'm sitting here with like two laptops and two phones trying to do work. Um, but digital inequity is real, and it impacts, how Indigenous students learn, and all of the other things, that we encounter. But there I was with my very first laptop, and I was at my grandparents' house, typing at their table, the kitchen table that I sat at for most of my life. And my grandfather was sitting in the chair across from me, looking out at Lake Huron, because the really beautiful thing for us is Lake Huron is right in our front yard. In the city here, I absolutely miss that view of Lake Huron. And so I was sitting there with my grandfather taking a break from, all of the heady stuff that was going on with writing. And he sat there when he had his hands clasped like this together, and he was staring off in the distance. And I said, "What are you thinking about?" And he said, "I wish I was smart. I wish I was smart enough to give you the things that you needed to succeed." And he was crying, and then I started crying. And I gave him a big hug, and I said, "You've given me everything that school and books could never teach me, because um, I was raised by my grandparents, my maternal grandparents in Kettle and Stony Point. My grandfather is a first language speaker of Anishinaabe. And so I am the last generation in my family to grow up hearing Anishinaabe spoken as a first language in our home. And so I'm not fluent. I'm not nearly as fluent as a first language speaker. But for me, language is, so much a part of how I identify and how I see the world. And there's a lot to be said for being bilingual, and especially if you speak and understand an Indigenous language, because it's so different than the English language. So there I was with my grandfather, and we were embracing and crying, because I thought, this is what colonialism has done. It's taught the people that I love and respect the most that they don't have value, but they have value to us. They have value to me. And so I said, "You have given me all of the things that books could never do." And so while we were in that emotional moment, I went to look at a hat that was hanging above the stairway that leads to the basement in my grandparents' house, and it was a really old hat. Um, and I have another story for that. I guess that's one thing. If you know me very well, I can pull a story out of my back pocket. But the gist of this story right now is that in 45 minutes of spending time with my grandparents after taking a break from writing, I thought, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, is just sit here at my grandparents' table and listen to them and hear stories. And I went back to school, I think, like the next day or the following week, and I told Rebecca that I didn't want to finish. And she said, you have to finish. And, I had gone through ethics and everything. And so I did complete my program. But my paradigm shift that happened was that, what I thought of as being a leader in education wasn't tied to policy, but it was tied to listening to the stories of my grandparents and my elders and community members, and really understanding the value that carries. And so ever since then, all of the work that I've done has put me in the way, or I put myself in the way of sitting with teachers, cultural teachers and language speakers and elders, my grandparents. I'm kind of a pain in the ass, but to me, that it's so important. And it wasn't until a few years ago, that I started to get invited to be able to share things, to share stories, and none of them are written down, except for Love Song for the Thunderbirds. And this is because that's how storytelling was passed down to me. And so when I started being invited as a storyteller to different events and organizations and workshops, to me, being called a storyteller, identified as a storyteller by my community members, is such a great honor, because for us, the stories that I heard growing up were never written down. They're just committed to memory, and they don't change. but every time you hear them, you take something different from the stories, and that's really the value of our storytelling. And I like to use the title land-based storytelling, because it makes people curious. And I think oftentimes there's the stereotype or the trope of the, you know, the stoic indigenous person who's very mystical and speaks to the spirits and the animals. And but really, land-based storytelling is about relationship to land, relationship to your relatives, relationships to all of the living beings that we share space with. And that is what land-based storytelling is. And the other part of land-based storytelling is that our language, my language, Nnigiiwemin, plays a huge role in centering us, in centering our relationships, because unlike the English language, my language is verb based, it's adjective based, it's process based, it's essence based. So earlier when I introduced myself, and you know, in my language, Nnigiiwemin, Indigenous, Mong and Dodem, Wheel Kwadong, Minua Jodanong and Donjaba, Anishinaabe Kwe Minua Bodawatami Kwe Nindao. These are, what I'm telling you is, I have an Anishinaabe name. Nnigiiwemin is my Anishinaabe name. I have a clan, Mong and Dodem. Wheel Kwadong, Minua Jodanong and Donjaba. I'm from Kettle and Stony Point. And Anishinaabe Kwe Minua Bodawatami Kwe Nindao. And these are our introductory like cultural protocols, what we do when we meet new people and a new person. And you know, even if we are speaking in a very like prayerful way, we will introduce ourselves this way. And what I'm telling you in each of those declarations is that I have a name that was given to me in ceremony, and that name in ceremony connects me to spirit. And that name has a story, the story of how I got my name, the story of what exactly that name encompasses, the responsibilities that come along with that, the spiritual responsibilities of having that name. And I also told you, you know, I have a clan, Mong and Dodem. And so my clan is my extended family, and I have a responsibility to them. They have a responsibility to each other. We have a responsibility to community and to upholding that traditional governance system of Anishinaabe, of Anishinaabe. And the other part of that, when I say Mong and Dodem, so in English, you know the word totem. Totem comes from our word Dodem. And Dodem doesn't mean clan, it doesn't mean totem, it doesn't mean your animal spirit. Dodem comes from the word that we have for heart and the word that we also have for breast. And if you think about those things, when we think about our mothers, you know, that our first teachers and our first care providers, you know, cared for us and nurtured us from their breasts. And so that word Dodem it means your clan, but it means that those beings, that essence that nurtures us, that takes care of us. And so it's often funny, I see the word totem, but it doesn't mean what you think it means in English. And the same goes for, you know, telling you that I come from a territory. Wheelquedong, Minoa, Ajodanong, and Donjaba. It doesn't mean Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. I know plenty of people have visited, you know, Lake Huron and Ipperwash, Grand Bend. And so Wheelquedong means the place inside the bay. And if you looked at an aerial view of my community and where I grew up, situated right across from Lake Huron, I grew up inside the Bay. And when we say in Ndonjaba, an elder, like maybe 10 or 12 years ago now, and she's since passed on. That's why this knowledge is so precious. That's why, you know, I can write about it and I can put it in a book. But when it's something that's passed down to you orally through storytelling and interaction and engagement with your community members, you are building an affirming relationship. And so when I say Ndonjaba, Wheelquidong Ndonjaba, that's where I come from. Ndonjaba really means the place where I am restful, the place where that I find peace. And this is what, you know, my elder told me years ago when she was just learning language. You know, she was a residential school survivor and she was just relearning her language. And she wanted to share that with me. And so I always acknowledge her when I say that. And it's a story that I carry. When I give that acknowledgement, I also acknowledge her. And so that was, you know, our territorial acknowledgement. And that territorial acknowledgement, when you say that you are from a place, you are telling everyone that you have a responsibility to care for that place. So that's how, you know, like we do land acknowledgements now because that's part of like TRC practice. But for Indigenous nations, our practice in naming our territory is telling you that we are the caretakers of this territory. We carry responsibilities to the land and the water and all of the beings. And lastly, as part of my introduction, you know, I named my nation. I am Anishinaabe. I am Potawatomi. And we have stories, origin stories about being Anishinaabe and being Potawatomi. And so my whole introduction, as short as it was, carries so much depth and meaning, and it's all based in language and it's all based in storytelling. And the word structure really has no English equivalent. And so I always like to acknowledge that because land-based storytelling isn't, you know, it can be, you can go out on the land and you can tell stories, but land-based storytelling is naming and affirming all of those relationships. And so that's how I learned. I spent time with my grandparents. They didn't call it that. We didn't call it, you know, a traditional upbringing. That's just how I was raised. And so I lived with my grandparents from the time I was 3 years old to the time I was 15. So I spent the majority of my young life with my grandparents. And they're both amazing storytellers and knowledge keepers. And I'm so fortunate to have grown up with them. And I didn't realize, you know, until later on in life, you know, in like my late 20s and 30s and now my 40s, that it was a privilege to be raised by my grandparents. I grew up learning language in my home. I grew up learning about traditional foods and food preparation. My grandfather, if you can believe it or not, you know, he was a hunter and fisherman most of his life. And so we lived off the land. You know, I don't recall going to the grocery store very often in my childhood. And that's really special. A lot of my friends and even my cousins who I grew up with didn't have the same upbringing. And so I didn't know then that all of the things that I was learning just by virtue of being being alive and being in the presence of my grandparents and doing everyday things was something that was going to, I guess, help me help others. And so that's where, you know, a lot of my life and work has been, is sharing those things through storytelling. And one of the things that I understand about land-based storytelling is that Land-based storytelling is, it puts you in direct relationship with your territory, with the land that you are on. And there's a word in Nnigiiwemin for teacher. And the word in Anishinaabe for teacher, well, or to teach, the verb is akinomage. Akinomage, and that speaks to a couple of different ideas. And the first is that word for earth, ake. Akinomage is like, to stretch the word out, is a person who can speak to the land, like all of the things. If you are an expert, like if you are a professor, you can speak to all things in your field of expertise. It's the same with if you are a teacher in the language. Akinomage is saying that you carry the responsibility and the knowledge to speak to all of the things in your territory. And so that word teach or teacher is very land-based. And so a lot of the words in our language come from having a deep reverence and respect for those relationships, non-human relationships to the land. In English, I'm just going to speak a little bit right now about the Ipperwash exhibit. We translated some of the introductory text, like 150 words of English text into Anishinaabe. And it was really difficult because I worked with a translator, and there are some things in English that have no direct translation in Anishinaabe. For instance, if I wanted to speak about land loss, which happened, the appropriation of land, talking about land loss when we don't have in our language anything that speaks to ownership, because if anything, the land owns us. The land in our language, the land is mother. You can't own your mother, but your mother takes care of you. Your mother teaches you, your mother guides you, your mother nurtures you and supports you and protects you. And so there is no word in our language that can speak to those concepts. And so that's why it took a long time to translate 150 words of English text into Anishinaabe. And so I can't even imagine when I think about the treaty era. When I think about the treaty era and how difficult it was for me and a language speaker today working on 150 words of English text, what might the process have looked like 150 years ago when they were making treaties and signing treaties? Because there was a huge movement to expedite treaties after the War of 1812, and especially in this area. And so I think, that with an understanding of the English language and also Anishinaabe, my ancestors, I can say for certain, had a completely different idea of what those agreements meant. And so that's why language is so important. Language is such a necessary component of land-based learning, because within language, I have an idea of how my ancestors think or thought and perceived the world, and how I also look at and perceive the world. I call them putting on my Anishinaabe glasses when I speak my language, because it truly is like that. If you are a bilingual person, the closest thing that I can always sort of relate it to, I'm dating myself here, is if you've seen the first Matrix and you see all of the binary code floating down the screen, and Neo is looking at the binary code and the other guy is kind of going, oh, well, this is the lady in the red dress, did you like that? And Neo is at first doesn't see it and then he sees it. And so that's what it's like being bilingual, is language isn't just a way that we express ourselves. It's a program. Language is a program for seeing and understanding the world. And I think coming from a bilingual household and family, that's really, been such a game changer and a mind changer for me, when it comes to storytelling and when it comes to sharing my story. So I guess I'll get into my story. And I thought about, I had a meeting with Ara a week ago or so, and we were talking about, what would the sharing look like tonight, and I have a couple of stories that I like sharing, especially when I want to talk about land-based learning and land-based storytelling. Um, and then I thought, well, I just wrote a play, so why not share about the play? And I do want to encourage you. The play is available online until January 3rd. If you go to the Grand Theatre website, um, I can put the link in for tickets. You have to register for them, but it's free to view until January 3rd. So if you'd like to watch the play, and I'm going to tell you as best as I can about the play and about my process, because it really did take me on a journey. And so I'll start my screen share and get set up over here. So this image here um, is from the play. It's the stage set up, and there was a lot of thought uh, behind all of this, and I'll get to that in a moment. But last year, around February or March, I was approached by the Grand Theatre um, to create something for their grand reopening this October that's just passed. And at the time, I had no idea. I had no idea the scope or the scale, or what was going to happen. I was just really excited to be invited to be a part of this. And so I was approached by the festival director, and she said, "Do you want to come play in our sandbox here at the Grand Theatre? Do you want to create?" And I said, "Of course, yes." It was COVID. It was a lockdown. I thought, what an exciting opportunity. And so what I ended up doing was I gave thought to what this production could be, what I wanted to share, and especially given that it would be at the Grand Theatre. And one of the things that was really challenging for me, again, as an Indigenous storyteller, and artist, and also because I went through my undergrad years at Western, completely immersed in Western storytelling and literature and art. I thought, wow, what would my story look like in a space like this? Because what I think of, is that the canon for Western art is European. It centers, the perspectives and experiences of white male Europeans. And what does it mean then, for the classics or the canon to be understood and performed and studied on Indigenous land? And what's my place in all of that? And so I my original intention in creating and curating performances for the reopening was to center people in place, to um, have Indigenous audience members, maybe, who had never ever been to the theater before, come into the space and see themselves, to recognize the iconography, to recognize the stories, to recognize the songs, and to see their experiences reflected back to them. And for non-Indigenous theatergoers, I wanted them to understand and recognize the land that they are on, that all of these institutions occupy. And so I thought, how am I going to do this? That's, I had this idea, and I was really attached to you know uh, having Indigenous stories reflected, but also having non-Indigenous theater goers understand and I guess gain some empathy for the experiences of Indigenous people, because I really feel like um, in exploring truth and reconciliation and what that means to heal relationships, you can't do that without empathy. And so it was really important then to be able to make these, I guess, the overall vision that I had and the feeling that I had for this production begin with that. And so that's why you see here uh, what this space is visually to me is that it occupies three different realms. It occupies, a very like the earth, the earth realm. It occupies the cosmos, and in the story, it occupies like the inner space and the very intimate space between the characters. And so I love this. I'm just gushing. I'm gushing because, on one hand, yes, it's my story, but two, it took a whole team and a company of people to bring this story to life. And so these beautiful humans that you see here, Jessica Wild, Jesus Najwan, and Montana Summers, are Nokomis, Jackrabbit, and Thunderbird. And so they are the characters that make this story come to life. But when I think about it, and while I was writing, I had some stories in mind to tell and stories that I like to share. And I thought, well, how am I going to write this into a script? And so if you know me and you know me very well, you will know that I am equal parts Nokomis, Jackrabbit, and Thunderbird. And that these characters live inside of me because these are my experiences and how I came to understand myself, and how I came to step into the gifts that I was given, that are the gift of storytelling that I learned from my grandparents, and how that plays out here. So this was really special. And with young people, what I like to share is the story of how I got my Anishinaabe name, Nnigiiwemin, in ceremony. And so my Anishinaabe name, Nnigiiwemin, means four Thunderbirds. And I got my name in ceremony when I was 17. And I was a very, angry, rebellious 17-year-old who hated school. And I was good at it, but I didn't like it. And I was so ready to quit. And the one thing that my mother knew that she could do and help me with, and help me with having a sense of purpose, was to ask for my Anishinaabe name in ceremony. And so we did ceremony, and I was given the name for Thunderbirds, which at 17, I felt very small. I felt very unworthy. And that's colonialism. That's internalized colonialism right there, is that I didn't feel worthy of my own name. And so I spent many years and talking with many elders, searching for, meaning and purpose in having a name like for Thunderbirds. And so that was why I have the character of Jackrabbit, and I have the character of Thunderbird, and we have Nokomis featured in here. And one of the story arcs um, follows like our traditional storytelling, and we save those stories. They're called Adzukan, and they're our sacred stories, and they're saved for certain times of the year, and only certain people who have a complete knowledge of those stories can share them. But we have stories about our trickster figure named Nanabush, who lived with their grandmother Nokomis in a little lodge, and so Nanabush is a trickster type figure. And so within this story, within Love Song for the Thunderbirds, Jackrabbit, who is in the center, um, is kind of a Nanabush figure. They're not perfect, and that's what I like about the Nanabush stories, is that Nanabush is not a perfect being. They make lots of mistakes, um, and their elder is their Nokomis. And so I thought this is the kind of story that I want to tell, that follows the arc of like a Nanabush story. It also follows the arc of the hero's journey, and you know how within this story Jackrabbit goes on a journey to find themselves, to be able to help their Nokomis, to be able to help carry forward all of the stories that Nokomis has shared with them. And so this image here represents, the three of those characters in the story, but also three components of my own personal story. And I just wanted to kind of share this image because I also think it's very cool. So in the story, Jackrabbit is tasked with, if we're following the hero's journey, Jackrabbit is tasked with retrieving a lullaby, the words to a lullaby that was sung to them by Nokomis, and that Nokomis learned from her mother, who went to residential school. And so this is a very true story for me, because the lullaby and the words to the lullaby that Jackrabbit goes in search of in this story is a journey that I went on. And so my grandmother sang to me a song that we in our family call Atata. And there are no words to Atata. And for many, many years, I thought this was my special song. And there were different variations to Atata that my gram would sing to me. And, we call Atata vocable. If you've ever heard powwow music, and like the sort of the sounds that are strung together are what we call vocables. And so they don't really have any English or correlates in the language. They're just, sounds, and they're rhythmic. And sometimes my grandmother would sing some words, and she would add the names of our family members, or she would sing Bayo Baby. And I thought, I'm the only person in this world who has ever heard this song, and it's so special. Until a few years ago, when I was, listening to music on YouTube, and I'm gonna ask Jonathan if he can cue up the song, because I heard this song recorded on YouTube, and I thought, that's my song. What are these women doing, singing my special song? And So I have that here for you to listen to, just a snippet to get a taste of the melody and the rhythm of the song.
Well, damn it, let's singers, give us a love song at the ha 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 ha. Me ta 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 ta. Oh, that's Shoni. Yongi ya we the hey. Yongi ya we the hey. Yongi ya we the hey. Me ta 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 ta. Oh, that's Shoni. Yongi ya we the hey. Yongi ya we the hey. Yongi ya we the hey. Me tie 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 tie. Oh, that's Shoni. Yongi ya we the hey. Yongi ya we the hey. Yongi ya we the hey. Oh, my darling, how I love you. See you at the party line. Won't you come dance with me? Hold me all night. We tie, 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 tie. Oh, that's Shoni.
So that was the Nnigiiwemin singers singing a song that you can find on YouTube called Mohawk Love Song. And I was so shocked when I heard it because that's the lullaby, that's the tune of the lullaby that I heard growing up that I knew as Atata. And these images here that you see on the left, the young woman on the far left is my great grandmother. And this is an image of her. It's the only image that I know of my great grandmother at residential school. And you can see the residential school behind her called Mount Elgin Residential School that we know in our communities as the Mushbowl. And so my great grandmother was about 12 or 13 in this photo, and these two young women who are with her are young girls from Oneida. And so I asked a friend of mine from Oneida, Lodand, if he could tell me about Mohawk Love Song. And I had to tell him the story about, I saw this online and this is the tune of the song that I heard growing up, that I know as Atata. And I gave him all of the story around it. I said, but is it an Oneida song? Is it a Haudenosaunee song? So I'm Anishinaabe, they're Haudenosaunee. We're different nations. We have different origin stories. We have different languages. We have different cultures. And yet, close by here, just outside of London, you have 3 First Nations communities who are Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape. They have different languages and cultures. And I need to stress that because oftentimes people think that, again, we're all the same, that our languages are the same, that our histories are the same, that our experiences are the same, and they're not. And so I asked my friend about the song, and he's a language keeper and he's a knowledge keeper for his community. And he told me that no, it's not actually Mohawk Love Song. So that's more of a contemporary version. But he said it does come from a song that their elders sang to them called Ganastahaleni. And Ganastahaleni in Oneida, in the Oneida language, is a song called the Cornbread Song. And cornbread in Iroquois cornbread is different than what you might think of as cornbread. It looks different, it tastes different, it's not baked, it's boiled, and it's shaped like a wheel. And it tastes really good. But the song is called Ganastahaleni. And it was a song that was sung by their elders. It's not a traditional song, but it was a song to help children go to sleep. And so I thought, how is it that my Anishinaabe grandmother, great grandmother, had the tune of an Oneida lullaby, Ganasahalini, but we called it Atata. And I understood that my grandmother's best friends in residential school were from the community of Oneida. And again, if you think about what residential school was like for Indigenous children, we were forbidden from speaking our languages, from practicing our culture, singing our songs, anything that would identify as Indigenous, as Anishinaabe, as Ongwehongwe. The intent was to destroy that, to kill the Indian and save the child. And so these young children on the left here, these are those children. These are my grandmother and her friends in residential school. And so because my great grandmother isn't here anymore to tell the story of the song, I had to imagine that the reason why we don't have lyrics and that I didn't have lyrics to Atata growing up is because they had to be very secretive about those things. And yet, when I think about that experience, you know, and the trauma that was experienced by the children, it was also children who protected Indigenous knowledge. They protected in the only ways that they could Indigenous songs and storytelling. And so that song then is something that I heard, but was given to me by my grandmother, who heard it from her mother, who heard it from young girls in residential school. And the image on the right here is, again, the woman featured is my great grandmother as a young woman, as a young mother. And these are her children. My grandmother, who raised me, is the tall girl with the braids and the dark shirt. And so it was my grandmother who shared this song with me that she learned from her mother. And when I was thinking about, again, going back to the purpose of this play and storytelling and wanting to locate people in place, I understood then that this song is what locates us. It's what unites us together. It's the kinship between our communities and our families. And it disrupts a narrative of conflict. And I think about, you know, especially in land acknowledgements and a lot of the history texts, you know, that will talk about pre-contact history and the history of Indigenous people and European relations after contact. And it's focused on conflict. And that is a very colonial and Western style of storytelling. And for Indigenous nations and communities and people, our storytelling focuses on relationship and collaboration. And this song and how this story focuses on finding Jackrabbit on a journey to find the lyrics to the song for Nokomis, for his grandmother, is that story of collaboration and relationship and kinship. And it disrupts a very colonial narrative of conflict, and especially among Indigenous nations. And I really have strong feelings about the conflict narrative, because I feel like that conflict narrative serves the purpose of advancing the idea of land ownership. Who was here first? Who owned this? When really that narrative doesn't recognize the long-standing historical and ongoing present-day relationships of Indigenous nations to each other. And so I wanted to acknowledge that and share these images with you of my grandmother and her friends in residential school, my grandmother, great grandmother as a young woman, and a young mother here on the right. And here I am with my friends singing. I'm just going to skip over that.
Oh, damn it, quest
Oh,
singers,
no.
give us a love song.
Okay. Technology. Okay, sorry about that. And I guess this, for me, locating people in place through song. In this image on the bottom right, this is Mount Elgin Residential School. This is the mush hole. And up here on the left is an image of the 1492 Lambeck Lane. And these two things, the storytelling, the songs, everything is inextricably tied to the experiences of residential school, to the experiences of genocide and colonialism, and the absolute intent on destroying Indigenous peoples, and destroying and devastating Indigenous cultures and languages and knowledge transmission. And so storytelling and land-based storytelling is more than just a creative pursuit. It's tied to the land back movement, because really, when we're talking about land back, it's not just, the physical land itself, because for us, we are related to the land. It's also about language back. It's about stories back. It's about culture back, songs back, families back. Because as we know, residential school, the 60s scoop, and even today, the numbers of Indigenous children in custody outnumbers the children who went to residential school. But the absolute intent was to destroy families, first by taking the land, and then also by taking the children from their communities, from their families. And I hope that, earlier when I explained, relationship and how even when we do our introductions, it demonstrates the importance of why relationships are key for understanding Anishinaabe worldviews, and how devastating then and violent these acts of taking children from their families was and is, and why this movement to tell our stories in the way that we understand them, in the way that we can share them, that is so very different, I think, from a Western style of storytelling, is important, because it is land-based. It is land-based storytelling, because we're connected. There is that that thread that ties us to communities, to families, to nation, to land, and to spirit. And I think that's really important for me. And while I was developing this play, I wanted to be sure that those things were centered and understood. And these adorable children are myself and my brother. And my brother is in the cradle board. That was actually my cradle board, and then it was his cradle board. But the practice of putting children in cradle boards is very traditional, and it's a cultural practice. And there's a lot of teachings that go along with it. And when I said earlier, that that it was important for us to be able to have things that are recognizable in practice, in iconography, and how the play itself moved along, that things were identifiable. And it's, for instance, in the play there is a baby swing. We call it a bayo, but it's a baby swing. And I was very privileged. I can't even, tell you how appreciative I am of the fact that I was carried in a cradle board by my mother when I was a child, when I was an infant. And I also had a baby swing. And the baby swing is featured in the story of Love Song for the Thunderbirds. And you can see it here on the left. This is a more traditional baby swing. And this is actually the kind of baby swing that I had, that, you know, we continue in our family, the tradition of putting babies in the baby swing, in a bio. And over here, the bio was a big part of the stage design for Love Song for the Thunderbird. And it was really important for me to show these things because there is a story behind them. There is a huge within our communities, and it was really nice for me afterwards to speak to theater goers who saw the baby swing and they got it. But I was, when I was a baby, my grandmother would rock me to sleep with that song Atata in a baby swing. And you know, now I recognize, you know, how very special that was. And I guess another thing that I would love to, I guess, just add about the play, because really I'm also a very big nerd. I'm a big Star Wars nerd, and I love Lord of the Rings and movies like The Dark Crystal. And so there is that element in the play, you know, and I wanted to touch on this in this talk because years ago, I had the opportunity to listen to Anishinaabe elder Jim Dumont and Mohawk elder Kevin Deere share creation story teachings. But Kevin Deere's presentation was so interesting to me because he talked about Mohawk Haudenosaunee stories and how they had captured the interest of Joseph Campbell, who, you know, as you know, has done a lot of work in comparative like mythology and the study of mythology and world mythology. But he spent a lot of time in Mohawk communities in New York. And so then George Lucas was fascinated with the writing of Joseph Campbell. And then George Lucas then produced Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back and all of the movies that when I was a child captured my imagination. And for Indigenous kids, for little res kids like myself and my cousins, they made sense. These movies and stories made sense to us. And it wasn't until I heard Kevin Deere speak a number of years ago when he talked about the connection between George Lucas and Joseph Campbell, and then Joseph Campbell and spending time in Mohawk communities in New York. So for me, it's like no wonder why these stories are familiar to me in a way that, you know, they speak to my spirit, they speak to my soul, because we have these stories in our cultures. And so within the play, you know, Nnigiiwemin is kind of like, you know, the Yoda figure or the mystic figure. And she has all of these, you know, nuggets of wisdom that she's passing on to Jackrabbit. And so I guess I wanted to touch on that aspect of, you know, like the story of this play for myself, you know, that it encompasses our traditional stories. It encompasses our family stories. And for me, you know, it's also a tribute to my favorite stories in you know, pop culture, like Star Wars, like The Dark Crystal. But also that because these stories are so recognizable to me. And I think for me, the big gift then was sharing this back, you know, it's called Love Song for the Thunderbirds. And it follows that arc of the hero's journey. And, you know, Jackrabbit puts aside their own ego to embrace their gifts and the knowledge that they need in order to retrieve Nnigiiwemin's song, Nnigiiwemin's lullaby, the words to that for her. But the real gift was to be able to share this with community. Because when I consider that, you know, because of, you know, recent events and you know, the recovery of the bodies of children, Indigenous children, from mass graves, this year was a really heavy year. It was a really heavy year for Indigenous people and in our communities, and especially because there are two residential schools that were just outside of London, Ontario. There's Mount Elgin and also the Mohawk Institute in Brantford. And so it was a real gift to be able to share this story with my community, and to give tribute to my grandmothers and my grandfathers and everything that I had learned from them. Which, you know, at the time when I was a young person, I had no idea that I would be the last person in my family to hear Nnigiiwemin spoken as a first language, to really understand what it's like to see the world through a bilingual lens, to hear stories from our community, you know, and these aren't the Adlakan, these aren't the sacred stories, these are family and community stories, and yet they have purpose. They build kinship, they build relationship, they affirm our long-standing relationships to each other and to the land, and even the sad stories, the very tragic stories that have happened, you know, on our land because of colonialism. And so Love Song for the Thunderbirds, you know, is not just the love song or the lullaby for Nnigiiwemin, but it's a love song to my community. And I'm just really thrilled that I was able to create something, and I pitched. I went through like the pitch process with the Grand Theater because I still had to, you know, sell this idea that I had for the play, and I'm just happy that they went for it, and I think that was also a lesson, you know, a learning experience, because working with Indigenous stories, Indigenous communities, Indigenous performers and artists and creatives is all part of the decolonizing process, you know, that each of our institutions, I hope, you know, are undertaking. And there's a lot of learning and sharing, and a lot of putting aside of egos, you know, to facilitate this process of decolonizing. And I just want to close with that I'll post the link, or Jonathan, if Jonathan can post the link to register to watch the play at the Grand. I would love it if you had the opportunity to view it as well. So Nnigiiwemin, I'm going to stop my share and take any questions or comments that you may have, and I'm excited to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Summer, thank you so much. That was a gift again. Thank you. I did have a chance to see Love Song for the Thunderbirds at the Grand Theater in October, and the play and the whole program that you designed for that evening was so beautiful. And I was actually in the Grand again last night and looked up and saw all the beautiful orange feathers hanging from the bottom of the staircase that are going to stay and remain there. And it remains a part of that whole experience for me. So I have put the link up in the chat. So if anybody, I would encourage anybody to go and see it. I really enjoyed that talk, and you covered so much ground. And I know we do have a couple of students on the panel here who have prepared questions with your permission. And I don't know that this is something they'll want to do, but having heard your talk, it may be that their question is modified a little. And would that be okay with you if they asked us, like, if they felt like, oh no, I really need to ask this other burning question right now? Would that be okay?
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. So maybe I'll call on Asde Odlin, who's in the 4th year SASAH class, to ask her question.
Hi, Summer. Thank you so much for this beautiful storytelling. My question is actually related to the storytelling and the land acknowledgement. When I saw the title of your talk, I thought about how I, as a non-Indigenous and a borrower of the land, would I want to acknowledge the land, and what are some elements of storytelling I want to bring in when I am writing or I'm expressing the acknowledgement of the land. I know you touched on it. If you can just briefly mention it, that would be great.
I'm thank you for asking that question. And it's so important. I often think that land acknowledgements are, they're a practice that have come out of the TRC. And Sarah May Chitty in Indigenous Initiatives has been working on an amazing resource for land acknowledgements. And I think that, like, for myself, understanding what the origins of a land acknowledgement are, what they're meant to evoke because of the TRC. And I feel like land acknowledgements need to be given teeth. I say that a land acknowledgement needs teeth. And especially because of the events, because we know now of the increasing number of mass graves of Indigenous students, of Indigenous children of residential school, that the horror is real. And it's something that's very tangible for our communities. And so I think going forward, a land acknowledgement needs teeth, and it needs to acknowledge colonial violence, because without acknowledging colonial violence, we skip over and we gloss over the history of, why is it that we are doing this today? Why is it that we are even giving a land acknowledgement? Why is it I think it's important, to know the history of the 3 First Nations just outside of London, and to know that there was a residential school just outside of London. And so I feel that land acknowledgements need to address colonial violence. If they are going to serve a purpose, that they should address colonial violence. And within this territory, because there was a residential school that a number of, like, my relatives and our community relatives, grandparents, parents, great-grandparents went to, I think a land acknowledgement or an acknowledgement of the territory should include that history. And it should include something that is actionable going forward. Like, you can acknowledge the land and you can acknowledge the history, the ongoing history. But I think in order for a land acknowledgement to be transformative, it needs to include language that is transformative and that calls people to action, that it mobilizes change. And I think otherwise, if you're not doing that through your land acknowledgement, you're not really acknowledging the history of our communities, of our people, and of the people that are here today. So that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, that we really need to think so hard about the stories we tell in the land acknowledgements. And I listened to your talk about land acknowledgements earlier this year, and I remember your words about they need to have teeth. And some of us, I think, feel so worried about putting the teeth in the land acknowledgement, but you really are encouraging us to be bold and to do that.
And I think that's the uncomfortable part,
Yeah.
you know, and I feel like if ever there was a time to show your teeth, it's now. And otherwise, you know, this history of ongoing colonial violence keeps happening, and there's nothing that changes. Our story won't change, you know, until there is, you know, all of these things that are happening systemically around us, institutionally, in the territory that we occupy and share together. And I feel the same way about mentioning the treaties. This is the other hat that I wear. But I feel very strongly about mentioning the treaties. You know, if you're going to mention the Upper Canada treaties, or if you're going to mention the Wampum Belt agreements, there's a real learning and understanding that needs to happen, because, you know, we can say that we say them, and they can be performative, but to really demonstrate commitment to these agreements is to show partnership, to show allyship and responsibility and respect and reciprocity. And I feel like in naming the treaties, a land acknowledgement should also name the responsibilities that accompany being party to those treaties, being a descendant of ancestors who were signatories to those treaties. Because guaranteed earlier, like, you know, I mentioned the importance of language, and while I was working on text to be translated for the Ipperwash exhibit at Museum London, 150 words of text, and then the Nnigiiwemin translation took, I think, about 3 weeks, and we were working under a really tight deadline then. 3 weeks to do the translation, but a lot of that is because concepts in English have no direct meaning or equivalent in Anishinaabe, and so I think, you know, a fulsome understanding of the treaties, of the Upper Canada treaties, if you're naming them, and a very, you know, at least, you know, a very intentional understanding of the wampum agreements and what those mean for us is really important, because I feel like a lot of places and people, you know, they want to do the right thing, but I think the right thing right now has to do with creating something actionable and transformative out of the acknowledgements.
Thanks. I know we're starting to get close to our ending time. Thank you for that, Summer. I do want to make sure that we can fit in at least one more question, and maybe someone, if you have a question you'd like to ask, you could put it in the Q&A. But right now I'll call on Andrew Fullerton, also from the 4th year SASAH class, to ask his question.
Hi, Summer. It's great to meet you. My question today is about reading materials. So at Western, one of the things that I'm really privileged to be a part of in SASAH is that there are lots of reading materials for us on colonial power dynamics, colonial violence. But where I think I would like to learn more, and where a lot of my peers are also interested in learning more, is about the Anishinaabe or otherwise Indigenous worldview, and that lens of understanding the world, because I've had a difficult time finding reading materials and accessing information that can help me understand that actual worldview and perception of life.
I like that question. I like that question because it speaks to so many things that are happening, I think, in the world of education and academia, because if you consider the timeline for residential school, and different policies, as they have occurred for Indigenous people, namely under the Indian Act, where we didn't have the right to vote as citizens until 1951, 1961. I think my dates might be turned around. But what's important to understand there is in 1918, women in Canada had the right to vote. Indigenous people did not have the right to vote until about 20 or so years later. And even I guess for me, understanding that my grandmother who raised me, she didn't go to residential school. She went to day school. Was one of the first people in our community. There were 4 young girls, including my grandmother, who were the first Indigenous students to go to the provincial high school. And so understanding that segregation happened, that residential school, there was segregation in the school system, and so Indigenous students weren't even allowed in the provincial school system until my grams in her 80s, so this would have been like 1952. So there's a huge gap in the, I guess, the academic literature and knowledge that's produced, and the capacity, because we're doing that now. Like there's the Faculty of Indigenous Studies or Department of Indigenous Studies at Western, and there's Indigenous initiatives. But in terms of learning about Anishinaabe people and Anishinaabe worldviews, for me, I still go back to the importance of relationship and spending time with people and folks, and hearing those stories and perspectives. And that requires a lot of courage, and it requires a lot of bravery to extend and want to build relationships to hear those things. Because again, our histories and our cultures and how I heard them and understood them weren't things that were written down. I had to hear the same story from my grandparents over and over and over. And, I sometimes would be like, I would tell the story wrong just so that they could tell me the right way to hear it and to understand it. So, I mean, there are lots of resources. There's lots of literature out there. But I think to get the experience of hearing Indigenous stories, and I guess in this way, from a more land-based perspective, involves relationship building. And I think that's a good start. It's, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think that a willingness to start forming, relationships with the Indigenous community, academic scholars, and the community on campus there is a good place to start hearing those stories firsthand. And I think that for me, like there's things that you can read in books, and there's lots of like television programs and movies out right now, or TV series, but I feel like land-based storytelling isn't something that you can read in a book or you can experience from a book. And I guess if there were recommendations, I think of Leanne Simpson right away. And she's, an artist, storyteller, scholar, academic, and activist. And I think, if you wanted to, I guess, read something, Dancing on Our Turtle's Back by Leanne Simpson is always a good start. And I think that I'm kind of stuck right now. So yeah, that's all I want to say for that. And thank you so much, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Andrew, I think that that was a great question. And I love the answer. Summer, you are pushing back on us. And I think thank you so much for doing that. And yeah, relationship, right? Is if we really want to find out, it's
Yeah.
about the land and it's about relationships. I want to thank you so much for your stories today, for what you've shared with us today and so many other days. I want to thank you for your answers to these students' questions and for being here with us today. I feel every time I get a chance to hear from you and others like Sarah May, I feel like the clouds are parting a little bit, and that's I feel very challenged, but I also feel like it's a really beautiful thing to have access to. So thank you so much. And I'm going to ask everyone else to just join me in thanking you for being with us today. And I think with that, I'm going to say good night to everybody. And I hope you all go off and have a wonderful dinner
Good
and
night.
enjoy the
Thank you so
evening.
much.
All right.